Hey everybody, welcome to episode 91 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be looking at how data science is being used to increase participation rates in the 2020 census in the United States. Most of you probably have heard of the census. It essentially counts everyone in the United States and provides some demographic information on the country, which is then used to proportion congressional seats, the Electoral College votes, and it decides in many ways how federal funding is spent. Now, if you've been following the news, you may have noticed that the census has been politicized recently with the Trump administration's request to ask a question about citizenship, basically asking respondents whether they are citizens of the United States. And that's been blocked in lower courts and, for now, the Supreme Court. And the idea behind it from the Trump administration side is to get in a sense of how many people in the country are actually citizens, whereas opponents say this is a strategy that will depress response rates among immigrants and minority groups. So that's about the extent to which I had heard about the census in the public debate, but as we'll talk about in this episode, the census is so much more complicated than that. And my guest today is Chris Dick. He is a director of applied data science at Census Analytics, which is a firm that has been started by Dan Wagner, who is the chief data scientist behind the Obama 2012 campaign. And Chris's work deals specifically with the census. He used to work there as a statistician. And at Census, he's been building data science tools that both model hard-to-count communities, those who are less likely to respond to the census. And he's also done some research beta testing different messages that can be sent to the population in order to increase response rates. Some work, some don't, and we'll find out which ones do or do not in this interview. So overall, just talking to Chris, I was blown away by how complicated the census is, but also how sophisticated the data science is behind increasing response rates this time around. And it's interesting to think that if the census happens every 10 years, then 2020 is going to be the iteration where digital is most saturated among the population. There's been a ton of experience from political campaigns and marketers in terms of digital outreach and messaging. So all of these things work in the census's favor. But of course, there are some political pressures from the top down that are trying to depress response rates, as we've seen with the citizenship question. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Chris. Again, he is the director of applied data science at Census Analytics. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Excited to be here.
Can you start out by giving us a brief overview of Census as a company and perhaps what sets it apart from public relations or political marketing firms?
Yeah, so Census Analytics is a data science consulting and technology company founded in 2013 by Dan Wagner, who is the former chief analytics officer of the Obama 2012 campaign. And basically what we do is we work throughout the commercial, nonprofit, and government sectors to really help our clients understand the populations that they're trying to reach, as well as putting in place repeatable data-driven solutions for all of our clients so that they don't have to do a one-off study every time they have a new campaign or a new data-driven initiative that they're really trying to put into place.
Right. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you is because data science really seems to be the focus. And I know you're doing a lot of work around the 2020 census, and we'll dive in detail with that in just a second. But first, you also have a background working as a statistician for the census. So can you describe what work that entailed and how it relates to the type of data science initiatives you're working on now?
Yeah, so right after grad school, I started as a statistician and then became a branch chief at the Census Bureau, working in an area called population division. So population division are kind of some of the subject matter experts on the demographic data, both from the decennial census, but also from different surveys and different estimates like the population estimates or the population projections. I focus specifically on the population estimates at the Census Bureau, which are the way that we know what the population is of all the states, counties, cities, towns, and all the years that don't end in zero. So all the years that we don't have that decennial census, the population estimates are really the way that we understand that. And two really important things about that kind of area is that, they use the decennial census as a base to build those population estimates for the decade. So a lot of my work there was really understanding, how the decennial census works and understanding the importance of the decennial census. Another really cool thing that area does is, every decennial census, there are two different measures of census quality. One of them is a post-enumeration survey, and the other is actually something called demographic analysis, where population division actually builds an estimate of the population on census day based on administrative records, so non-survey sources of data and non-enumeration sources of data. So they take birth and death records as well as estimates of immigration and emigration and rebuild the population as a way to compare to the census to kind of determine how good the census is. So from all of that, I just have this deep caring about the census and about the quality of the census. And that's really kind of what's pushed me to really focus on census as one of the areas that we're trying to help states and cities with here at Civis.
That's interesting. So the census is every 10 years, but then there's also a lot of other data that's being brought in order to kind of forecast, I guess, what's in between every 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Census Bureau builds population estimates, starting with the census, adding in births and deaths, and then estimates of in and out migration, both international and domestic in and out migration for, say, a county. And so they're building the actual, what is the population on, in their case, it's July 1st is the date they care about. That's the kind of focus date for the population estimates. So they do that every single year and release those data. Very, very important. They're used to weight all the different surveys that you can think of, the American Community Survey, the CPS. So very, very interesting and important project that goes on at the Census Bureau.
Yeah, interesting. Didn't know that. But let's set the stage a bit and talk about why the census is so important, particularly in the context of the upcoming 2020 census, which has been quite politicized recently with the potential addition of a question about one's citizenship status. That's been in the news. But there's also a bunch of other challenges that are facing the census this time around. So can you outline some of these challenges and how they might contribute to an undercount in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I always like to start out with why the census is important as well, right? So, a lot of people know about the role of the decennial census in the U.S. for apportionment and redistricting. Kind of the political outcomes that we have from the census. But it's also really, really important to understand that the census and products that come out of it really impact federal funding allocations for states, cities, and counties as well. It's also the gold standard of data for our country. So without a great decennial census, you're not going to have, solid information to use as weighting factors for all the different surveys that both the federal government does as well as many private companies. It's also, the gold standard for kind of understanding for businesses where they should place new stores, things like that. But, your question is really about why it's in trouble. And you mentioned the citizenship question. That's a clear issue that we have with the 2020 census and, something that's very, very important to look at. But there's also this underlying distrust of, social institutions, particularly federal and even state and local government. This makes people less likely to answer, surveys or enumerations like the 2020 census. There's also the issue that the Census Bureau's budget has not been as good as it should have been for the 2020 census. Not only has the top line number not been what it needs to be, but it actually took a lot longer to start increasing over this decade than it did for the 2010 census or the 2000 census. This has meant that things like end-to-end tests or dry runs of the census that are very, very important to the Census Bureau didn't happen or were made smaller than they should have been. Finally, you actually, the 2020 census and every census that the U.S. does is one of the largest peacetime efforts that the federal government does in the U.S. They have to hire hundreds of thousands of people. And right now they're trying to do that in a time of very low unemployment, which is going to make it even harder to hire all those folks that they need to go knock on doors and do follow-up for the census. So for all those reasons, we have a lot of concerns about what this census is going to look like. So it's very important for states and localities to be thinking about how they can do outreach to ensure that they have a good count.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about the unemployment rates because I remember the last census in 2010, I was in college and I had some college friends who would go out and serve as these, what do you call them, the outreach team?
Yeah, so the enumerators?
Yeah, the enumerators. And it was like $20 an hour, which for a college student was quite a bit of money. But I guess Also because the unemployment is so low, that might not be as appealing as it was 10 years ago during the financial crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely, I remember being at a discussion of one of the former Census Bureau directors, and one of his biggest concerns was just this, that the unemployment rate is low and it's going to be hard to hire enough people to do this work.
That's interesting. So, considering all of these challenges that the census has this time around, in a Washington Post article you wrote back in June, you argued that we need to treat the census as if it's the country's most important marketing campaign. And I think that's an interesting comparison. Can you kind of unpack that argument for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we just discussed, census is incredibly important for our democracy in the US, and it makes the stakes incredibly high. And on top of this, getting people to respond to the census has many of the same problems as any marketing or political campaign. That is, many campaigns face really a lot of these same problems. Who do you need to speak to? Who's hard to count? Who's easy to count? What do you need to say? Who needs to say it? And when and where do they need to say it? These are all problems that marketers face every single day, and census is no different. Really, the audience for us here is not only the whole population, but specifically folks who are harder to count. And really, the influencers kind of in this space are folks that we like to call trusted messengers. So really understanding who can reach out to these hard to count populations that they will trust is one of the key pieces of census outreach. And we can talk kind of more about that throughout this process.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you about those hard to count communities and the data science behind modeling them. But you've already run a couple pilot studies and tested some messages aimed at increasing response rates for this census. And those studies, or at least one of them, used a Civis tool called Creative Focus. Can you describe what Creative Focus is and how you used it to get some initial insights into potentially increasing response rates for the census?
Yeah, so Creative Focus is a tool that Civis built, and it's basically our rapid message testing infrastructure. It allows us to basically run randomized controlled trials on different types of creative messages, images, videos even, and to understand which ones are moving the needle in the correct direction versus which ones are perhaps not moving the needle or even causing people to do the opposite of what you would like them to do. This is built on top of our data science platform, Civis platform, and allows us to really turn around some of these message testing research pieces in days, not weeks or months. And I want to talk a little bit about why this is important. We've done a little bit of research to show that in general, marketing messages, in kind of a broad study of many different types of messages, we found that approximately half of messages have the intended consequence of what you're trying to do, increasing sales of a particular product, getting people to vote for a particular candidate, getting people to respond to the census. The problem is the other 50% don't do what you want them to do, even when they're developed through, a good creative process. And fully, around 10% of those messages actually cause people to do the opposite of what you want them to do. So make them less likely to, say, respond to the census. So we did a little bit of research into this and actually found that this is the case with some of the messages that will potentially be used for the 2020 census. So the research we did took 4 different messages focusing on different areas. These included messages like a message focused on civic duty, or a message focused on the political impacts of the census, or a message focused on privacy and security, basically saying that your data are private and secure when the Census Bureau asks them. One of the things that we found is that privacy and security message actually made people less likely to respond to the census. Now, perhaps that's not all that surprising. You're bringing up privacy, security of data, makes people think about privacy and security of their data, and therefore less likely to answer the census. But it's important to note this because this is going to be a message that folks are talking about in the run-up to the census. And we really need to be thinking about the best ways to talk about it so that we don't depress response rates, especially in communities that are afraid about their own security.
Right. I thought that was interesting. A message saying, hey, your data is going to be, stored correctly and properly actually decreased responses to the census. But the one that did the best was the civic duty message, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is that idea that you're really doing your civic duty in terms of answering the census. And it's something that's in our Constitution. and is very important for all of us to take as a civic duty. One of the messages we didn't test, and we're going to be testing in the future, is the impact on people's local lives. So things like funding for the local firehouse or the local police department, and the impacts that can have on increasing or decreasing response rates.
Yeah, I think it's in this environment, it's refreshing to know that civic duty still matters.
Yeah, it's great.
And who would actually be doing this messaging? Or perhaps going back to the marketing analogy, who would be in charge of running these campaigns?
That's a great question, because for the census, it's very, very complicated. So the Census Bureau actually has their own integrated communications campaign, a huge operation. And this is, something that the Bureau is running. It's a federal survey, so they're clearly the ones who are responsible. But again, the stakes are so high that it's very, very important for states and localities to get involved in this outreach. And the Census Bureau actually has a program for them to be able to do that. And most states and localities have already signed up to do this. It's something called Census Complete Count Committees. So that's where a local government can sign up and actually be a partner of the Census Bureau to do their own outreach. So I think that, the easiest answer to your question is it's complicated. But really the answer is a lot of people need to be the voice of the census. As we talked about, the reason that some folks don't want to answer the census is because they're either fearful of or don't trust the government. Well, the person that would be responsible for kind of running that campaign then perhaps, doesn't always need to be the government. It could be a foundation or a nonprofit. So really what we're looking at here is representation from federal government, state and local government, as well as community groups such as nonprofits and foundations.
Interesting. And how would these messages actually reach potential census takers? Is it more through traditional outreach initiatives like direct mail, or are digital initiatives also in the mix?
Well, one of the really interesting things with the 2020 census is it's the first time that we have a truly digital first census. So again, I'm gonna start with my favorite answer of it's a bit complicated, and really it's going to be a mix of all of those channels. But one of the really, really important things about the census is, the Census Bureau is going to have their own advertising campaign that goes through TV, through digital, through a lot of different modes. States and localities can kind of make some of their own decisions. The things that they need to be thinking about is what is the best way to reach different parts of the community. For some of them, it may be direct mail, it may be digital, but oftentimes it also needs to be things like community meetings or person-to-person interaction, because a lot of what people need is a trusted partner to tell them that it's okay to answer the census.
Right.
That could be the pastor in their church. It could be a well-known community member, or it could be one of their neighbors even. So it's really important that we're thinking of all of these different channels, and that we're all thinking of building tools that can, help get the word out through all of these different channels.
Yeah, definitely. And as you kind of alluded to before, one of the key elements of these campaigns is identifying that target audience. And you've built some tools around identifying what are called hard to count communities. Mm-hmm. And from a look at the dashboard on your website, it looks like you've leveraged some GIS data with survey data. So I'm wondering if you could pop open the hood and describe a bit how you've been using data science to model these hard to count communities.
Yeah. So, one of the most important things in any kind of marketing or outreach campaign here is going through kind of a multiple step process to understand the population that you're trying to reach, right? So the first thing is understanding who's hard to count. This is where we can leverage data both from the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau has created something called low response scores, all the way down to a census kind of block group or tract level, that tell you within, that particular geographic area, how likely is it that people are going to respond or not respond to the census? The next step of that is actually trying to understand why they're likely to respond or not respond to the census. So again, the Census Bureau provides some data here, and there are other ways that we can collect data as well. So the Census Bureau has something called the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators Study. So this is both survey research as well as focus groups that the Census Bureau went out and did to try to understand why people are hard to count or easy to count. And you can bring those data together with the demographic information and other information that you can get from the low response scores. So those are two pieces. The next step of that is kind of actually building your messages. Again, the Census Bureau is going to be building some of their own messages. A lot of states and localities are going to be building their own messages. The one thing that we really like to talk about is taking those messages and making sure to test them. As we just talked about in that national level message test that we did, we found that some messages that the Bureau is likely to use could potentially decrease response rates. We want to make sure if we're going to be using those messages that we're really thinking it through. And then finally, we want to be able to take all of that information and make it actionable to folks who are on the ground, either through digital advertising or through folks who are going to be talking at community events. So the tool that we've built has taken a lot of those data resources and brought them all together in one place in what we're calling our Census Intelligence Center. And so kind of what we've done is we've taken the low response scores from the Census Bureau, kind of built some of our own scores on top of them using machine learning techniques as well as additional data sources, such as commercial data, to really understand at both a block group, but even potentially lower level of geographic aggregation, where these hard to count communities are so that we can be as efficient and effective in our outreach as possible. From there, we've brought together data sources from the Census Bureau, so the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators Study, or CBAMS, together with those geographic data. We're also working with some communities to do more localized CBAMS type studies so that they can understand some of the barriers, attitudes, and motivators that are more local based than what the Census Bureau was able to find. So we bring that together with the demographic data. We're then able to test any of the creative that folks have to ensure that it works and to tie it back to the different groups it works for. So there might be messages that say work better for the Latino community than they do for the Asian community. What we're able to do is take those hard to count kind of maps and map back those best messages so that people know if they're in a particular neighborhood, this is the message that they should be using versus this message number 2 for the other community. So that's generally kind of the approach that we're trying to take for the 2020 census and helping states and local communities.
Geez, so much data. I love it.
I know it's a ton of data. And I didn't even talk about the fact that there's also going to be the opportunity in the 2020 census to kind of have rapid response. So the Census Bureau is going to be releasing data on a nightly basis. And so what you're able to do is if you have an idea of what a response rate or a response rate curve should look like over the entire kind of census outreach period, you can optimize your resources within your community for areas that are under or overperforming. And that's another thing that we're working with states and localities on as well.
Right, because that's what I wanted to ask you is once you have these kind of digital platforms built, with all of this data and all of this modeling, then you can actually feed data into it in real time, right, as the census is going along.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big pieces that we want people to be able to do is if they have an idea of a few different interventions that might work to, get folks out and getting counted, it's great to do a lot of that research beforehand, but we can also continually do some of the testing of what works during the actual fielding of the census. And we can see, if you have a couple small trials of interventions once the census starts in just small areas of your community, and you find that one works really well, you can spread that out to the rest of your community in an effective and efficient way.
Right. And one of the things I was curious about is, because you have this centralized platform and you can sort of monitor these insights in real time, might it be that, hard to count communities in one area of the country, say Texas, by feeding in the data, can that be used to increase similar communities, let's say in, Connecticut or something like that? Like, can you use the data in order to better inform initiatives in other parts of the country with this data?
Yeah, so the fact that there are going to be a lot of public data sources coming out during the fielding of the census allows us to gain insight throughout the country and in kind of the way that you're talking about. On top of that, as we're working together with different communities, one thing that we're trying to talk to folks about is the potential for data sharing agreements kind of between these different localities so that they can learn even more from potentially the results that we're finding within their cities that are not just directly available from the Census Bureau. So I think the answer to that is kind of on two different levels. Absolutely people are going to be able to learn from what's going on, let's say in Texas, out in California. But they're also able to learn even more if they're willing to share more data with each other.
Right. Now, my last question for you has to deal with something we've talked a bit about on the show, which is the difference between an advocacy campaign and a political campaign. And most of the guests we've had tend to say that political campaigns are special because they operate on a certain end date, and the kind of whole strategy is built around, that election day, whereas advocacy campaigns are more, open-ended. But the census is kind of a hybrid between the two because it's sort of like a public advocacy initiative, but at the same time, it has this end date. So kind of how do you see that temporal element of the census working into the kind of outreach initiatives that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes them different than a lot of advocacy campaigns. Even though as you noted, there's a lot of similarities. The end date means that you actually do have to build tools that have that kind of ingrained into the tool. So understanding when the outreach for the census is actually going to begin, or when non-response follow-up is going to begin, needs to be built in really to both your plans and to your tools. So you're right. It's kind of a mix of some of the work that folks do throughout political campaigns, as well as some of the work that we do in advocacy campaigns that have more cycles and are more ongoing. Really, the biggest key here that I think is the differentiator is this ability to really optimize in real time. And the importance of that optimizing in real time and kind of being very, very quick to steer the ship in the right direction as it's going kind of either in a good or bad direction, especially the month and a half period of self-response for the 2020 census.
Well, I was definitely initially a bit worried with all the challenges you posed, but it seems like there's lots of data and effort being put to increase response rates this time around. And I think it's fascinating. So Chris, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Chris Dick, Director of Applied Data Science at Civis Analytics. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Dr. Sebastian Valenzuela, Associate Professor of Communication at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And we'll be talking about how different social media platforms create different networks that have different effects on protest participation. Until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.